Hello dear students. So today we will be dealing with Ovid's Metamorphosis, the third book especially, which is there in your prescribed CU syllabus. Now the metamorphosis is a Latin term. It is in plural. Metamorphosis primarily means transformation, SIS, and when you use the SES, that becomes plural, transformations. Now, Ovid's Metamorphosis is a Latin narrative poem which dates back to the 8th century, and Ovid was a Roman poet. Now, this is considered to be his magnum opus, the Metamorphosis, and the poem spans over a huge chunk of human activity. That is, it deals with the creation till the deification of Julius Caesar. Now, this is a chronicle. Chronicle is a pseudo history, it's a mythical rendition of history, and Ovid covers over 250 myths in 15 books, and the entire text is of almost 12,000 lines, 11,995 to be accurate. Let's say almost 12,000 lines. Now, it is very difficult to talk about the genre of the Metamorphosis because the Metamorphosis cannot be properly fit into any one genre. All right. It has several features of the epic, it has several features of narrative poetry, it has several features of myth, it has several features of fable, parable, and so on and so forth. All the features are enmeshed. There is the feature of the folklore, the folk tale, and so on and so forth. Now, therefore, it is very difficult to actually put it in one genre. However, we can be sure of one thing, that is, where did Ovid get his inspiration from? Now look, the myths that Ovid talks about were already existing before even Ovid decided to write about them. And he more or less followed the earlier treatments of the myth, but he diverged from the earlier authors in his exposition of the myths. That is, he kept the story the same, but the treatment towards the story changed. And you know, Ovid has remained as an enduring influence in the Western culture, influencing people like Dante Alighieri, Giovanni Boccaccio, William Shakespeare, Geoffrey Chaucer, and many, many other people. And during the Renaissance, there was a particularly keen interest in reading Ovid's poetry. But after the Renaissance, somehow this interest died down. Although in the 20th century, this interest was rekindled and many, many authors, scholars turned back to Ovid for inspiration. Now, Ovid has been widely translated today, but the first English translation that we find of Ovid was in 1480 by William Caxton. Now, if we talk about the sources of Ovid, then the first source that comes to mind is the old form of Alexandrian poetry. Now, Alexandrian poetry, basically what it did was, it basically created a sort of bucolic poetry. Okay, and this genre of poetry was first developed by Theocritus. Later, Virgil wrote his eclogues in this genre, and many, many other great scholars actually wrote their poetry in this typical Alexandrian tradition. Now, in this tradition, something is very important. That is, myth in this tradition functions as a vehicle for a sort of insight, a sort of moral reflection. Yet, when Ovid went to write in this tradition, he changed it a bit. That is, he believed in the play, the object of play. He wanted to play with his objects. He wanted to look at them from different perspectives. And he has a sort of artful manipulation of his subject matter. And therefore, what happens is that in Ovid, we find a very different flavor of the same myth. Now, the model for a collection of myths which deal with metamorphosis was found in the Metamorphosis poetry, which was another genre, which is there in the Greek tradition, which we call the Hellenistic tradition. Now, there is one poet about whom we hear. His name is Boio, Boio. Now, Boio wrote a poem called Ornithogonia, Ornithogonia. Now, Ornithogonia is now found in a very fragmentary state, but Ornithogonia, for the first time, talks about it is a collection, rather, of myths where humans were metamorphosed into birds. And later Hellenistic writers have also dealt with the same theme of metamorphosis, not necessarily from human to birds, but they have dealt with the same theme of metamorphosis. But little is known about their poetry. I'll just name them. Okay. Now, Nicander of Colophon is really well known for his heteroeumena, Heteroiomena. Now, heteroeumena is really a great influence on Ovid because 21 of the 250 stories, of the 250 myths in Ovid's Metamorphosis were taken from heteroeumena. However, many other sources remain. And one issue in the Greek times, especially when you studied Greek drama, you have come across it, I am sure. That is, they used to deal with the known myths. They used to deal with the known myths. And they used to, the interesting thing was not what the myth is. The interesting thing for them was how the myth is retold. Like if, say, the plays that Sophocles, Aeschylus, Euripides wrote, those stories were mostly known by the people. And what was important was how Ovid treated them. And or what was important was how Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Euripides treated them, and not the story in itself. So therefore, the treatment became very important, and Ovid went back to this tradition. Now, Karl Galinski writes something very beautiful. He writes, Ovid's relation to the Hellenistic poets was similar to the attitude of the Hellenistic poets themselves to their predecessors. He demonstrated that he had read their versions, but that he could still treat the myths in his own way. And therefore, what I was saying, that is, the treatment becomes important, the telling becomes important more than the tale itself. Now, as I was saying, that there is no watertight compartmentalization of the genre of metamorphosis. Some people